What if one law could erase the idea of owning land overnight? Not limit it, not regulate it, but remove it completely. Not in theory, not in a debate, but in reality. That is exactly what just happened in Burkina Faso under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré. And the consequences of that decision may reach far beyond Africa, because this is not just a policy change. This is a complete reset of how power works. For decades, land has been treated as the ultimate asset. The more you own, the more control you have. Governments sell it. Corporations accumulate it. Wealthy individuals hold it. And everyone else fights over what remains. That has been the system, not just in Africa, but across the world. But what happens when that system disappears? In one move, Burkina Faso declared that all land belongs to the state, not to foreign investors, not to local elites, not even to private citizens. Ownership, as the world understands it, is gone. In its place comes something far more radical: access. And that single shift changes everything. Because if you cannot buy land, you cannot hoard it. If you cannot hoard it, you cannot control it. And if you cannot control it, power begins to move. But here is the question no one is asking out loud. If land is no longer something you can own, then who truly holds the future of a nation? Before we break down what this means for Africa, for global markets, and for everyday people trying to survive on that land, take a moment. And if you want to understand where the world might be heading next, make sure you're subscribed. Because what you're about to hear isn't just news. It's a shift in the rules of the game. And once those rules change, there is no going back. To understand why this decision matters, you have to look at what existed before it. For years, land across Burkina Faso followed a pattern that will feel familiar to many older viewers. On paper, land could be bought, sold, transferred, and accumulated like any other asset. But in practice, that system created a quiet imbalance. Large portions of land gradually concentrated in the hands of those with capital, urban elites, connected figures, and in some cases, foreign interests operating through long-term arrangements. Meanwhile, the majority of citizens, especially in rural areas, worked land they did not truly control. They farmed it, they depended on it, but they did not own it. And that difference between working land and controlling land is where the real story begins. Because when you do not control the land you depend on, every decision becomes uncertain. You hesitate to invest. You hesitate to improve the soil. You hesitate to plan for the future. The land feeds you today, but it does not belong to you tomorrow. That uncertainty quietly limits productivity, income, and stability across entire communities. This is the structural problem that Ibrahim Traoré is attempting to address, not with subsidies, not with speeches, but with a complete redesign of the system itself. The new framework is simple on the surface, but profound in its implications. The state becomes the legal owner of all land. Private ownership, as a tradable commodity, is removed from the equation. Instead of buying land, citizens gain the right to access and use it under national structures designed to prioritize production, stability, and long-term planning. Now, at first glance, this may sound restrictive. In many parts of the world, ownership is seen as freedom. But here is where the logic begins to shift, because ownership can also concentrate power. When land is treated purely as a market asset, it naturally flows toward those who can afford to accumulate it. Over time, that creates large holdings, underutilized areas, and barriers for smaller producers trying to enter or expand. The system rewards accumulation, not necessarily productivity. But when land is treated as a national resource, something that cannot be permanently owned or traded, the incentives begin to change. Access replaces accumulation. Use replaces speculation. Production replaces control. Imagine two different scenarios. In the first, one individual or entity holds thousands of hectares. Some of it may be used, but much of it remains idle, waiting for future value. The land becomes a store of wealth rather than a source of activity. In the second, that same land is distributed through structured access to hundreds or thousands of individuals who actively use it, growing crops, raising livestock, building small-scale enterprises. The land becomes productive, not static. This is the shift the government is attempting to create. But the policy does not stop at removing ownership. It goes further by directing access towards specific groups that have historically been limited by the previous system. Small farmers are among the first to benefit. Instead of renting land under uncertain conditions, they gain structured access supported by agricultural programs, irrigation systems, and training initiatives. This changes not just their income, but their decision-making. When farmers feel secure in their access, they invest more. They plan further ahead. They shift from survival to strategy. Then come women's cooperatives. In many rural economies, women carry a significant share of agricultural work, but often lack formal control over land. By allocating access directly to organized groups of women, the system introduces a different kind of stability. When women manage production, income tends to circulate within households, supporting education, nutrition, and long-term well-being. And then there is the youth. In a country where a large portion of the population is young, the challenge has never been a lack of people. It has been a lack of opportunity. Without access to land or employment, many young individuals migrate to cities or look for alternatives that do not always lead to stability. By tying land access to structured economic programs, the government is attempting to transform that demographic pressure into productive capacity. Instead of leaving the land, the youth can return to it with tools, training, and a pathway to income. This is where the policy moves beyond theory and begins to affect everyday life. Land is no longer just a legal concept. It becomes a platform for production, a platform for income, a platform for dignity. Because when people have secure access to the land they depend on, something subtle but powerful changes. They are no longer temporary participants in the economy. They become stakeholders. But as this transformation begins to take shape, another reality emerges, one that is less visible, but just as important. When power shifts in one direction, it inevitably leaves a vacuum somewhere else. And the question now is not only who gains from this system, but who stands to lose. When a country changes, who controls land? It does not just adjust policy, it shifts power, and power rarely moves quietly. As the new system began to take shape in Burkina Faso, the reactions came quickly, though not always loudly. Some were public, others more subtle. But taken together, they reveal something important. This decision is not being viewed as routine reform. It is being treated as a signal. Inside the country, the first reactions were mixed. For many small farmers and rural families, the shift created a sense of cautious optimism. The idea that land could no longer be taken, sold, or transferred without regard to those who depend on it, introduced a new kind of stability. It suggested that access would no longer be determined purely by money or connections, but by participation and purpose. But for others, especially those who had benefited from the previous system, the change raised immediate concerns. Local elites who had accumulated large tracts of land suddenly faced a new reality. Land was no longer an asset they could expand, trade, or leverage in the same way. Its role as a store of wealth was being reduced, and with it, a portion of their economic influence. This was not just a financial adjustment, it was a structural one, because when land stops functioning as private capital, It also stops reinforcing existing hierarchies, and that creates friction. At the same time, questions began to surface among business communities, both domestic and international. Investors who were used to acquiring land directly now had to rethink their approach. The new model does not eliminate investment, but it changes its terms. Instead of ownership, it offers long-term leases aligned with national priorities. For some, this is manageable. For others, it introduces uncertainty. Ownership provides control. Leasing requires negotiation. And in global markets, where predictability often drives decisions, even small shifts in control structures can influence how capital moves. This is where the conversation expands beyond national borders. Observers outside Burkina Faso have begun to interpret this policy through a broader lens. Some analysts frame it as a move toward economic sovereignty, a deliberate attempt to reduce dependency on external actors and retain greater control over national resources. Others see it as a risk, arguing that limiting ownership could discourage certain forms of foreign investment. Both perspectives exist at the same time, and both raise valid questions, because while access-based systems can improve distribution and local participation, they also require strong governance to function effectively. Land must be allocated fairly. Records must be maintained accurately. Disputes must be resolved transparently. Without these elements, even well-intentioned reforms can face implementation challenges. This is the balancing point the country now faces. Internally, expectations are rising. People who have gained access to land are not just looking for opportunity. They are looking for results. They expect improved production, better infrastructure, and tangible improvements in their daily lives. Externally, scrutiny is increasing. Governments, institutions, and investors are watching closely, trying to understand whether this model represents a sustainable path or a temporary experiment. But beyond these immediate reactions, there is a deeper layer that is beginning to take shape, a psychological shift. For decades, many resource-rich countries operated within a familiar framework. Land, minerals, and other assets were integrated into global systems where ownership and control often extended beyond national borders. That framework created both opportunities and dependencies. What is happening now suggests a different approach. Instead of asking how to fit into existing systems, the question is becoming how to redefine the terms of participation. And that is where the implications grow larger. Because if this model demonstrates measurable results, if agricultural output increases, if rural stability improves, if local economies strengthen, then it does more than transform one country. It provides a reference point. Other nations with similar challenges may begin to ask whether alternative structures are possible, not identical structures, but variations adapted to their own conditions. This is how policy evolves into precedent, and precedent, over time, can influence direction. But none of this happens in isolation. Every shift in structure creates a response somewhere else in the system. Markets adjust. Partnerships evolve. Narratives form. Some will describe this as a necessary correction. Others will frame it as a disruption. The reality, as always, lies somewhere in between. What is clear is that the stakes are no longer theoretical. This is not a debate about ideas on paper. It is a test unfolding in real time, one that will be measured not by statements or reactions, but by outcomes. Will access translate into productivity? Will redistribution lead to stability? Will control create resilience? These are the questions that now define the moment. And as those questions move from discussion to reality, one thing becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. When a nation changes the foundation of ownership, it does not just alter its economy. It begins to redefine its future. And whether that future strengthens or struggles will depend on what comes next. When a nation redefines land, It does not only change economics, it reshapes how people live, how communities function, and how the state relates to its citizens. In Burkina Faso, the consequences are already moving beyond policy and into everyday life. At the most immediate level, the reform begins to alter the relationship between citizens and the state. In many systems, land ownership is a private matter. Individuals hold titles, make decisions, and operate largely within their own boundaries. But under this new model, land becomes a shared national asset, managed through public structures. That shift increases the role of the state, not only as regulator, but as custodian. This creates both opportunity and responsibility. On one hand, centralized management allows for more coordinated planning. Infrastructure projects no longer need to navigate fragmented private ownership. Agricultural zones can be organized with irrigation, storage, and transport in mind. Industrial areas can be developed with clearer long-term strategies. In theory, this reduces inefficiencies that often slow development. On the other hand, it places significant pressure on governance. Because when the state controls access to land, decisions about allocation become highly consequential. Who receives land? Under what conditions? For how long? These are no longer abstract questions. They directly affect livelihoods, income, and stability. If managed transparently, the system can build trust. If mismanaged, it can do the opposite. This is where accountability becomes central. Citizens who gain access to land expect consistency and fairness. They expect that access will not change unpredictably or depend on connections. They expect that rules will be applied evenly. Meeting those expectations is not optional. It is essential for maintaining legitimacy. At the community level, the reform begins to reshape social dynamics. In rural areas, where land has long been tied to tradition, inheritance, and informal agreements, the introduction of a centralized system changes how disputes are handled. Clearer national records and standardized access structures can reduce long-standing conflicts over boundaries and usage. Fewer disputes mean less time in courts, fewer tensions between neighbors, and more focus on production. Stability at this level is often underestimated, but it has far-reaching effects. When people are confident in their access to land, they are more likely to invest in it, building irrigation systems, improving soil quality, diversifying crops. These decisions, repeated across thousands of communities, can gradually strengthen food systems and local economies. There is also a broader social effect linked to dignity. For individuals who have historically worked land without secure control, gaining structured access changes more than income. It changes perception. They are no longer temporary participants or dependent labor. They become recognized contributors within a national framework. This shift can influence how people view their role in society. Work becomes more than survival. It becomes participation, and participation builds connection to community, to economy, and to the state itself. However, these changes also introduce new political considerations. As access expands, expectations expand with it. Citizens who see improvements will expect continuity. They will expect policies to remain stable and to deliver results over time. This increases pressure on leadership to maintain performance, not just intention. At the same time, groups that experience reduced influence under the new system may seek to adapt or respond. Economic power does not disappear, it shifts. And when it shifts, it often reconfigures itself in new ways. This dynamic is not unique to Burkina Faso. It appears in many societies undergoing structural change. The key difference lies in how transitions are managed, whether they remain inclusive or become contested. Another important dimension is institutional capacity. Implementing a centralized land system requires reliable administrative structures. Records must be maintained accurately. Allocation processes must be clear. Oversight mechanisms must function effectively. Without these elements, Even a well-designed policy can face practical limitations. This is where long-term outcomes will be determined. The reform itself sets the direction. The institutions determine the result. If systems are strengthened alongside policy, the model can create lasting stability. If gaps remain, challenges may emerge that require adjustment. Ultimately, the civil and political consequences of this reform converge on a single point: trust. Trust that access will be fair. Trust that rules will be consistent. Trust that the system will serve the people it was designed for. Because land, in this context, is more than territory. It is a foundation for economic activity, for social stability, and for the relationship between citizens and the state. And as that foundation is rebuilt, one question continues to take shape. If control over land can redefine a nation internally, what happens when that idea begins to extend beyond its borders? When a country changes how land is controlled, the impact does not stop at its borders. It begins to ripple outward, first through neighboring states, then through regional systems, and eventually into the broader global conversation. What is happening in Burkina Faso is already moving in that direction. Across West Africa, land has long been tied to similar challenges: uneven access, informal ownership, external pressure, and growing demand from both domestic and international actors. Because of this, policy shifts in one country rarely go unnoticed by others facing comparable conditions. In recent years, several nations have begun re-examining how strategic resources, land, minerals, and energy are managed. The question is no longer only how to attract investment, but how to structure it in a way that aligns with national priorities. Within that context, Burkina Faso's approach introduces a distinct variation. Instead of adjusting ownership rules at the margins, it redefines them entirely. That kind of shift naturally draws attention. For some governments, it presents a potential reference point, not necessarily a model to copy directly, but an example that expands the range of what is considered possible. If land can be treated as a nationally managed asset rather than a fully tradable commodity, then other policy frameworks may also be open to reconsideration. This is how regional trends begin, not through identical adoption, but through adaptation. At the same time, the policy intersects with broader economic dynamics. Agriculture remains a central sector across much of the region. Decisions about land influence food production, supply chains, and price stability. If structured access leads to higher productivity and more consistent output, it can strengthen domestic markets and reduce reliance on imports. That, in turn, affects trade patterns within the region. Similarly, the shift toward local processing, growing, transforming, and consuming within national or regional systems can gradually reshape value chains. Instead of exporting raw products and importing finished goods, countries may begin retaining more stages of production internally. These are long-term processes, but they often begin with foundational changes like land policy. Beyond the region, the implications extend into global investment frameworks. International investors are accustomed to operating in environments where land ownership or long-term control is clearly defined and transferable. When that assumption changes, investment strategies must adjust. Projects may shift toward partnership models, long-term leases, or joint ventures that align with national guidelines. For some investors, this represents a barrier. For others, it is simply a different structure. The key variable becomes predictability. If rules are clear, consistent, and enforced transparently, new models can still attract participation. If they are uncertain or frequently changing, hesitation increases. This is not unique to any one country. It applies to all markets where structural reforms are introduced. There is also a geopolitical dimension. Land, like other strategic resources, influences how countries position themselves within global systems. Greater control over internal assets can increase autonomy in decision-making. It can allow governments to negotiate partnerships on different terms, prioritizing long-term outcomes over short-term gains. At the same time, it requires careful balancing. Engagement with external partners remains important for technology, capital, and expertise. The objective is not isolation, but alignment, ensuring that external involvement supports rather than defines national direction. This is where perception begins to matter. Different observers will interpret the same policy in different ways. Some will view it as a step toward resilience and self-determination. Others will see it as a departure from familiar frameworks that have governed international investment for decades. Both interpretations will coexist. What ultimately shapes the narrative is performance. If the policy leads to improved production, stronger local economies, and greater stability, it reinforces one perspective. If it encounters significant challenges, it strengthens the other. In that sense, the reform is not only a national decision, it is a live case study. A case study that other countries, institutions, and investors are watching closely. Because the broader question extends beyond any single policy or location. If land, one of the most fundamental assets in any economy, can be restructured in this way, what other systems might be open to change? A law can be signed in a single moment, but the reality it creates unfolds over years. In Burkina Faso, the decision to centralize land ownership has already changed the structure of the system. What remains uncertain is how that structure will perform under pressure: economic, social, and institutional. There are two paths emerging from this moment. The first is a path of consolidation and growth. If access to land continues to expand in a structured and transparent way, productivity could increase steadily. Farmers who feel secure in their access are more likely to invest in better techniques, diversify crops, and improve yields. Over time, this can strengthen food systems, stabilize prices, and reduce dependence on external supply chains. If support systems evolve alongside access, irrigation, storage, training, and local processing, the impact could extend beyond agriculture. Small-scale enterprises may grow. Rural economies may stabilize. Migration patterns may begin to shift, with more people choosing to remain where opportunities are emerging. In this scenario, land becomes more than a resource. It becomes a platform for long-term development. But there is a second path, one defined by the challenges of implementation. Centralized systems require strong administration. Allocation processes must remain fair. Records must be accurate. Oversight must be consistent. If these elements weaken, gaps begin to appear. Access may become uneven. Efficiency may decline. Confidence may erode. Investment, both domestic and international, relies on clarity. If rules are not clearly understood or consistently applied, hesitation can grow. Projects may slow. Opportunities may be delayed. This is not a contradiction of the policy itself. It is a reminder that structure alone is not enough. Execution determines outcome. For Ibrahim Traoré and the institutions supporting this transition, the focus now shifts from decision to delivery. The success of the model will depend on how effectively systems are built around it, how access is managed, how disputes are resolved, and how productivity is supported over time. Because the law has already changed the rules. The next phase will determine whether those rules translate into results. And as that process unfolds, one reality becomes clear. The future of this reform will not be decided in declarations. It will be decided in fields, in communities, and in the daily lives of the people it was designed to serve.